High in the Andes sits a mountain that once reshaped the world. To the Inca, it was just another peak in their vast empire. To the Spanish, it became something closer to a miracle. The slopes of Cerro Rico, the rich hill, glittered with veins of silver so abundant that early prospectors joked the whole mountain was made of it. Within a generation, Potosí had swelled into one of the largest cities on Earth, larger than Paris or London at the time, its streets paved with silver dust and its skyline bristling with churches financed by the mines beneath. On the surface, this should have been the greatest stroke of luck in European history. Spain, a kingdom that had only recently finished uniting itself after centuries of internal conflict, suddenly found itself sitting on the greatest treasure hoard the world had ever known. Mountains of silver crossed the Atlantic each year, enough to fund wars, decorate cathedrals, and convince kings that Spain's empire was destined to endure forever. But this story does not end in triumph. The irony of Potosí is that the more silver Spain extracted, the weaker its empire became. What began as a jackpot slowly hardened into a curse. The Spanish monarchy grew addicted to treasure fleets, its economy grew hollow, and its constant wars consumed resources faster than the mines could supply them. By the time the flow of silver slowed, Spain was already locked into a decline it could not reverse. This is the paradox at the heart of Spain's empire, and it's one of the earliest examples in history of something we still see today, the way a sudden windfall of natural wealth can doom a nation rather than save it. At the dawn of the 16th century, Spain was not yet the unquestioned power of Europe. The union of Ferdinand and Isabella had brought Castile and Aragon under one crown, and the conquest of Granada in 1492 marked the end of Muslim rule on the Iberian Peninsula. Spain was emerging as a Catholic superstate, projecting itself as a defender of Christendom, but it still faced rivals in France, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Italian states. The discovery of the New World provided an opening. Initial expeditions returned with gold and exotic goods, but it was conquest that turned Spain into a major player. Hernán Cortés toppled the Aztec Empire, Francisco Pizarro dismantled the Inca, and the flow of wealth began in earnest. For a few years, it was looted treasure, melted down idols, seized jewelry, the spoils of conquest. But in 1545, prospectors in the Andes stumbled onto something far more important than plunder, a permanent, inexhaustible source of silver. Cerro Rico towered above the city of Potosí, like a pyramid of stone. Miners found seams of ore so rich that they barely needed refining. Word spread quickly, and within a few decades, Potosí had become a boomtown. By 1600, its population was estimated at 150,000, making it one of the largest urban centers in the world at the time. Spanish chroniclers marveled that its silver could supply the whole world, and in many ways, it did. From Potosí, silver traveled along mule trains across the Andes to the Pacific coast, then by ship to Panama, then across the isthmus and onto galleons bound for Seville. At the height of the trade, convoys of treasure ships escorted by armed warships crossed the Atlantic, bringing back hundreds of tons of bullion each year. Seville became the nerve center of Spain's new empire, its ports swollen with goods from the Americas and Asia. The Casa de Contratación, Spain's central trade office, carefully cataloged the treasure that arrived, and customs houses along the Guadalquivir River bustled with merchants and bankers, eager to get their hands on Spanish silver. The sums were staggering. Between the mid-1500s and early 1600s, tens of thousands of tons of silver flowed into Europe, much of it minted into the Real de a Ocho, the famous piece of 8. This coin circulated from the Americas to Asia and became the first global currency. To outsiders, it looked like Spain had struck upon inexhaustible wealth. Kings boasted that the sun never set on their empire. Courtiers dressed in silk and jewels, and Spanish armies marched across Europe as if backed by a treasury that could never run dry. For a generation, the illusion was convincing. Spain's rivals envied its riches, and poets compared its fortune to that of ancient Rome. But underneath the splendor was a flaw that would only grow deeper with each shipment of silver. Flooding an economy with treasure has consequences. As Spain's silver spread across Europe, it triggered what economists now call the price revolution. Prices for food, land, and everyday goods rose steadily, in some cases quadrupling over a century. For nobles and monarchs, the inflation could be managed. They had access to silver. For ordinary people, it meant daily life grew more expensive, as wages failed to keep pace. For Spain itself, the effect was devastating. Rather than using its new wealth to invest in industries or infrastructure, Spain spent freely on imports. Flemish weavers produced the fine cloth that Spanish nobles demanded, Italian bankers financed the crown's debts, and German merchants supplied the weapons and tools that kept Spain's armies in the field. Spanish silver flowed outward as quickly as it arrived, enriching other parts of Europe while hollowing out the Spanish economy. The monarchy leaned on treasure fleets to cover its costs, choosing not to reform its tax system or encourage domestic production. Why encourage a textile industry in Castile when silver could buy cloth abroad? Why encourage shipbuilding in Bilbao when Italian shipwrights could be paid with bullion? The very abundance of silver made long-term investment seem unnecessary. In the short term, it worked. Armies were paid, cities flourished, and Spain's prestige soared. But the deeper pattern was clear. Spain's wealth was built on extraction, not productivity. As long as ships crossed the Atlantic, the illusion could hold. But illusions, by definition, cannot last. The real test of Spain's silver wealth came in war. For Spain, the 16th century was not a time of peace, but of near constant conflict. As the leading Catholic power in Europe, Spain found itself embroiled in the French wars of religion, the revolt of the Netherlands, the defense of Italy against French expansion, and the long rivalry with England. On top of this were dynastic commitments to the Habsburg family, which tied Spain into wars in Central Europe. Silver allowed Spain to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously. It bankrolled mercenary armies in the Low Countries, funded the construction of the massive armada sent against England in 1588, and supported campaigns stretching from North Africa to the Pacific. Few empires in history have attempted to fight so many wars at once, but silver was not infinite, and war is the fastest way to burn through resources. Spain's armies consumed bullion faster than Potosí could supply it. By 1557, barely a decade after the richest seams of Cerro Rico had been discovered, the Spanish crown declared bankruptcy. It would do so again in 1575, 1596, and repeatedly in the following century. The paradox was stark. The richest empire in Europe, commanding the world's largest silver supply, could not pay its bills. Each bankruptcy weakened Spain's credibility on the European stage. Creditors grew wary, rival powers became bolder, and Spain's reliance on silver made it vulnerable to piracy, shipwrecks, and interruptions in transatlantic trade. What should have been the foundation of unshakable dominance was instead the source of chronic instability. The mountain of silver that had promised to secure Spain's empire was already beginning to drag it into decline. If silver had stayed within Spain's borders, the story might have unfolded differently. But from the beginning, Spain's treasure was part of a much larger system. The bullion that crossed the Atlantic rarely lingered in Seville or Madrid. It passed through Spain's hands and then flowed outward, feeding a web of merchants, bankers, and empires that stretched across continents. Nowhere was this clearer than in Asia. By the mid-1500s, the Ming dynasty had shifted its tax system to require payments in silver. This was a profound change. Farmers, artisans, and merchants all needed silver to pay the state. Demand for the metal surged, and China became the ultimate destination for much of the world's supply. Spain, without intending to, became the main supplier. Silver mined in Bolivia or Mexico traveled first to Spain, then to the Low Countries or Italy, and from there to merchants who sent it east. But another route was even more direct, the Manila galleons. Each year, enormous ships set sail from Acapulco, crossed the Pacific, and arrived in the Philippines laden with American silver. In return, they carried silk, porcelain, and spices back to Mexico, goods that would then filter into Europe. The result was something unprecedented, a truly global economy. Silver was its bloodstream, moving wealth from the Andes to Asia and back again. Spain had unlocked a level of interconnectedness no previous empire had achieved. And yet, the irony was brutal. While silver stabilized China's economy and fueled commercial growth across the world, it left Spain itself weakened. The bullion Spain controlled was enriching its rivals and trading partners more than it enriched Spain. The very thing that should have secured its power was underwriting the rise of others. For all the grandeur of global trade, the source of Spain's wealth was far from glorious. The mountain at Potosí was not a miracle. It was a death sentence for countless thousands. The Spanish crown relied on a system of forced labor called the mita, adapted from an older Inca tradition of rotational service. In theory, it spread work obligations across communities. In practice, it was a brutal draft that sent indigenous men from across the Andes into the mines for months at a time. Conditions inside Cerro Rico were suffocating and dangerous. Shafts descended deep into the mountain, ventilation was poor, and collapses were common. Workers labored with mercury to refine ore, poisoning themselves in the process. Death rates were staggering. Contemporary observers spoke of whole villages depopulated by the mita. To replace the laborers lost, the Spanish also imported enslaved Africans, who faced the same deadly conditions. Over the centuries, millions of people are estimated to have died in or around Potosí. The nickname, the mountain that eats men, was not a metaphor. It was a grim description of reality. Above ground, however, Potosí projected an image of prosperity. The city boasted theaters, marketplaces, and churches plated with silver. Visitors wrote of balls, gambling houses, and feasts. For Spanish elites, Potosí was a showcase of wealth, a city where the empire's power was made visible. But this splendor was a facade built on suffering. Just as Spain's empire glittered abroad while hollowing itself at home, so too did Potosí dazzle, even as it consumed lives at an industrial scale. By the early 1600s, Spain's contradictions were impossible to ignore. On paper, it remained Europe's richest empire. In practice, it was locked in cycles of debt, war, and economic weakness. The flood of silver had discouraged domestic industry. Spanish clothmakers, ironworkers, and shipbuilders found themselves unable to compete with imports. The nobility, awash in bullion, preferred to purchase luxuries from abroad, rather than support local crafts. The crown, flush with treasure fleets, avoided the harder task of reforming taxation or fostering productivity at home. The wealth that should have laid the foundations of long-term strength instead eroded them. Meanwhile, Spain's dependence on silver made it fragile. Treasure fleets were tempting targets for pirates and privateers, from English raiders like Francis Drake to Dutch corsairs operating in the Caribbean. Storms could wreck convoys and plunge the crown into crisis. Entire campaigns hinged on whether a shipment arrived on time. When the flow faltered, the empire stumbled. And stumble it did. Wars drained resources faster than mines could supply them. The Dutch revolt dragged on for decades, costing men and money without resolution. The Armada, built at enormous expense, ended in disaster against England. In Central Europe, Spain's commitment to its Habsburg relatives tied it into conflicts it could not afford. Each effort leaned on silver, and each drained the empire further. Bankruptcies became almost routine. In 1557, then again in 1575, and again in 1596, the Spanish crown suspended payments. Each time, creditors recoiled, markets panicked, and Spain's reputation suffered. The irony deepened with each collapse. The empire with the world's richest mines could not balance its books. As the 17th century advanced, Spain's rivals adapted. England and the Dutch Republic, lacking vast silver reserves, built economies around trade, shipping, and eventually industry. France, under the Bourbons, centralized power and reformed finances. These powers grew stronger not because they had Spain's resources, but because they lacked them. They were forced to build sustainable systems, while Spain remained trapped by its silver dependence. By the late 1600s, Spain was still formidable on paper, but increasingly a shadow of its former self. Its armies were underfunded, its industries weak, and its rivals eager to carve away at its empire. The mountain of silver that had once promised eternal dominance had ensured decline instead. The empire was not destroyed overnight, but it had been set on a path of slow erosion, one that would see its colonies eventually slip away and its power eclipsed by neighbors who had once looked on with envy. The story of Potosí and Spain's silver is not just about one empire's rise and fall. It is about the dangerous illusion of easy wealth. Economists today call it the resource curse, the paradox that nations blessed with abundant resources often end up weaker in the long run. We've seen the same dynamic play out in modern times, whether the resource is oil, natural gas, diamonds, or even the rare earth minerals that power today's technology. The pattern repeats. Sudden riches discourage reform, fuel corruption, and create dependencies that crumble once the resource runs thin or the costs of extraction outweigh the gains. Spain's silver empire was an early case study. It dazzled Europe with treasure fleets and cathedrals filled with silver, but beneath the surface, it hollowed out the state, destroyed domestic productivity, and left the empire vulnerable. The true beneficiaries of Potosí's wealth were often Spain's rivals in Europe and its trading partners in Asia. The true victims were the millions who suffered and died extracting it. Today, the mountain still stands above Potosí, its slopes scarred by centuries of tunnels. Its silver is long exhausted, but its legacy remains. Spain found a mountain of treasure, and in the end, that mountain became the weight that dragged its empire down.